Welcome to the Theology Made podcast. I'm Jordan, and today we're going to look at the saint who invented the devil we know. If I asked you to picture the devil, what would you see? Horns, red skin, pointed tail, a pitchfork in one hand, a grin like he just told a dirty joke. But that's not the picture in history. Before the Middle Ages, Satan didn't look like that. He didn't have horns, there was no tail, and there was thankfully no red tights. The devil you know today, he's less a biblical figure and more a medieval invention, shaped by monks, molded by artists, and paraded through city streets by actors in heavy costumes. This is the story of how one saint's imagination and centuries of creative borrowing gave the devil his face. In early Christian art, in the 1st and 2nd centuries, the devil was a shapeshifter. He wasn't the fixed figure we know today, but a fluid, unsettling presence that could take on many forms. In the 3rd century catacombs in Rome, he appeared as a serpent, which is a deliberate nod to Genesis 3, where the tempter's power is subtle, coiled, and whispered rather than roared. And these underground frescoes, painted by persecuted believers, weren't concerned with horns or tails. They were focused on the story, the act of deception, more than on giving evil a permanent face. And by the 6th century, the Rabbula Gospels from Syria offered a very different portrayal. Here, Satan is shown as a dark, winged angel, a fallen figure still bearing the remnants of celestial glory. His beauty is shadowed, his wings now a reminder of what he once was. And this image was drawn from Ezekiel 28's lament over the anointed cherub and Isaiah 14, the fallen morning star. It was blending biblical poetry with the Eastern Church's visual imagination. And in the shimmering Byzantine mosaics of places like Ravenna and Constantinople, the devil sometimes looked, well, human. I mean, it was twisted, angular, kind of a monstrous hybrid, right? Claws, fangs, and strange animal features, but still sort of humanish. And there wasn't a single costume. Each artist, they shaped him to match the theological mood of the scene: a deceiver, a destroyer, a corrupting presence, a tempter. And part of this variety is because the Bible itself gives no fixed image of Satan. The term Satan in Hebrew is a title, and it simply means accuser or adversary. In Job, the Satan is a courtroom prosecutor, a spiritual attorney arguing that human righteousness is an illusion. It's actually unlikely that really is the devil as we know today. In Matthew 4, he's a tempter, persuasive, persistent, wielding Scripture itself as a weapon. In 1 Peter 5, he's compared to a roaring lion. That's danger personified, but also a predator who hunts by patience and opportunity. In Revelation 20, he's the deceiver of nations, a global saboteur, chained and released at key moments in the cosmic story. For the early church, the point wasn't to agree on what the devil looked like, but to understand what he did. Evil wasn't a mask or a color scheme. It was active, an intelligent force that corrupted, accused, tempted, and lied. Meaning, the early church, they feared his work far more than his wardrobe. By the late 4th century, the deserts of Egypt, Palestine, and Syria were home to a new kind of Christian, the monk. They lived in caves, crude huts, or isolated cells, seeking a life stripped of distraction. But far from escaping the battle, they believed they had moved to the front line of a war you couldn't see. These monks began describing spiritual warfare in almost cinematic terms. One of the earliest and most influential voices was Vagarius Ponticus. Drawing from years in the desert, he cataloged 8 logismoi, evil thoughts, that attacked believers. And they were not abstract temptations, they were personified enemies. Gluttony, that whispered about food during fasting hours. Lust, that painted vivid mental pictures in the mind's eye. Vainglory, that dangled visions of reputation and applause. He described them like assailants testing the monastery gates, looking for weaknesses. And then came John Cassian, a monk, theologian, and bridge between the Eastern desert tradition and the growing monastic movement in the West. And his institutes and conferences became spiritual classics, copied and read in monasteries for centuries. Cassian wrote about temptation as a strategic siege. Demons were not chaotic, they were disciplined. They studied the believer's habits, leaned into and learned the weak points, and attacked at opportune times. He would describe them as cunning generals, directing skirmishes, and patient hunters, willing to stalk for days or years. This wasn't the devil of vague superstition. Cassian made him personal, a thinking adversary who sets traps, changed tactics, and adapted like a master strategist. What Cassian didn't do was give the enemy goat legs or horns. But in making him a character with intellect, intent, and malice, he gave later generations something priceless: permission to imagine, to paint, carve, dramatize, and costume the enemy in ways that could communicate his danger to the illiterate and the learned alike. And his influence stretched through medieval monasticism, especially in Benedictine circles, where his works were read alongside scripture. So this was fertile soil, ready for artists and preachers to grow a devil the world could see. The leap from concept to costume began in the 10th to 12th centuries, a period when Christian Europe was visually reimagining almost every part of its theology. And artists needed a visual shorthand for evil that could be instantly recognized even by the illiterate. And they found it ready-made in the leftover imagery of pagan mythology. For the Greek world came Pan, horned, goat-legged, and wild-eyed. In ancient art, Pan roamed the hills playing his reed pipes, a god of fertility, lust, and chaos. His appearance was the perfect embodiment of untamed, dangerous appetite. And then from Roman culture came the faun and the satyr, mischievous woodland spirits with goat legs and human torsos, often painted in the company of wine, revelry, and temptation. These figures were already morally suspect in the Christian imagination. They represented a world outside of God's order. And by fusing these traits with the theological identity of the devil, medieval artists created an instantly recognizable villain. Horned, signaling bestial power and rebellion; cloven-hooved, making him not fully human, alien to God's design; hairy and wild, the opposite of ordered, cultivated world of Christian virtue. And the message was visual and immediate: this is the enemy of your soul. And one of the earliest surviving examples of the full hybrid is found in the Hortus Deliciarum, illustrated compendium compiled by the Abbess Herod of Landsberg in Alsace. In it, the devil appears as a horned, clawed creature, part man, part beast, presiding over the torments of the damned. This was no vague shadow. It was a fully realized character, drawn in colors and lines, bold enough to be understood without a single word of text. The red skin we associate with the devil today came later, solidifying in the Gothic period. It was tied to two converging ideas. First, hellfire imagery from apocalyptic preaching, where the devil ruled over a kingdom of flame. And then second, Gothic arts symbolism, the use of red for danger, sin, and blood, a visual warning that then was burned into the medieval imagination. And by the close of the 12th century, the devil had moved from this abstract adversary to a costumed, codified character, a face and form that could be carried into cathedrals, carved into stone, painted on walls, and paraded through the streets in trauma. The real branding of the devil didn't happen in monastery scriptoria or in the quiet turning of illuminated pages. It actually happened in the streets. From the 12th to the 16th century, towns and cities across Europe, they hosted mystery plays. These were massive public performances of biblical stories, staged in marketplaces and open squares. They were part religious education, part community spectacle, and guilds, churches, and even local governments sponsored them, transforming entire towns into open-air theaters. And for a largely illiterate population, these plays were the Bible in 3D. Noah's Ark would roll past on a cart, angels would descend from mechanical heaven rigs, the crucifixion would unfold in the town square, and somewhere in almost every cycle the devil would make his entrance. Stage directions from the Chester Mystery Plays, one of the best preserved English cycles, call for a foul devil in horrible array, wielding a fork. It wasn't subtle. Costumes featured horns, tails, fur, grotesque leather or papier-mâché masks, and claws exaggerated for effect. Sometimes the mask had hinged jaws that snapped open and shut. The pitchfork, which became one of the devil's most enduring props, was probably borrowed from Neptune's trident in classical imagery. On stage, it served a double duty: a weapon for jabbing sinners and a comic device for poking fellow actors or chasing townsfolk through the crowd. And these devils didn't just glower, they performed. They shouted insults at the audience, they taunted saints, and engaged in slapstick with demons and fools. In the French Mystère de Dame, the devil enters with swagger, mocking Adam and Eve before the fall. In German, devils scurry around in chaos, tripping over each other and mock incompetence. Audience loved the mix of menace and humor. The devil could terrify, looming over the crowd with a booming voice and monstrous form, but he could also make them laugh, slipping on stage props or losing a battle of wits to a quick-thinking angel. And by the late Middle Ages, the theatrical devil was a fixture of public imagination. Horns, tails, pitchforks, and wild antics weren't just stage devices. They became the default mental image of evil in the Western world, a picture that would persist for centuries. Major church art didn't just borrow the theatrical devil from the streets, it amplified it. Once the horns, tails, and claw made their way into church walls and manuscript pages, they carried not just entertainment value, but the theological weight. The devil's look was no longer just a prop, it became a sermon in stone and paint. Take the Autun Cathedral in Burgundy. In the Last Judgment scene, a horned Satan crouches at the scales, weighing human souls. His elongated, clawed fingers pull the balance towards damnation, while angels fight to tip it back. Every pilgrim entering the cathedral saw him there, a reminder that evil was not abstract, but watchful and cunning. And in the Hours of Catherine of Cleves, one of the most richly illuminated books of hours ever made, hell is imagined as a vast furnace. Devils, painted in deep reds and smoky blacks, prod the damned into flames with pitchforks. The devils themselves are hybrids of the theatrical and the grotesque, with bulging eyes, forked tongues, and curling horns. These aren't anonymous monsters, they're individuals, each with its own twisted personality. And then came Hieronymus Bosch, the Dutch master whose paintings like The Last Judgment and The Garden of Earthly Delights turned hell into a surreal, almost cinematic nightmare. He filled his panels with horned, grotesque, and impossible hybrids, fish-headed demons, bird-legged torturers, swollen bodies with human faces. His devils were not merely symbolic, they were psychological portrayals of temptation and corruption, bizarre as they might be. And by the Renaissance, this visual language was set in stone. Horns, hooves, tails, pitchforks. It was recognizable from Italy to England, and it wasn't confined to Catholic imagery. Protestant reformers embraced the same iconography in their woodcuts and pamphlets, now using the devil to lampoon theological opponents. Catholic clergy were often drawn with horns and tails in Reformation propaganda. Protestants found themselves similarly caricatured in Catholic broadsheets. The devil, he became a weapon in the war of images, an instant, understood accusation that needed no words. And by this point, the devil of medieval theater, cathedral sculptures, manuscript illumination, and polemical print was all the same. The shapeshifter of early Christian art had been replaced by a single, locked-in brand, the devil as we still picture today. And the image endured because it worked. It was memorable, even the illiterate knew it at a glance, fearsome, grotesque enough to warn, and mockable in plays he was a clown as much as a villain. But there was also a theological risk. By making evil look like something obvious and external, it was easier to miss the subtle internal reality, the kind C.S. Lewis would later warn us about in his Screwtape Letters. From Cassian's writings to mystery plays, pagan gods to cathedral carvings, the devil's costume is a medieval creation, part theology, part theater, part cultural recycling. And the devil you picture today isn't the one the Bible describes. It's the one the Middle Ages taught you to see. And perhaps that's the greatest trick of all, to make us think we'd recognize him if we saw him, when the real danger might look nothing like the costume.